Great. I think we'll go ahead and get our evening started. Thank you for being with us at the Mark Twain Library. I know tonight we are looking forward to a fascinating program about the potential of regenerative farming. And I would like to thank the Little Meadow Farm and the Reading Land Trust for partnering with us to make tonight possible. It's been a pleasure to work with both of them. We are a large group today, so the audience has been muted. We're using a webinar. However, we do want to hear from you, and would love you to type your questions into the Q&A function at any time throughout the program. And then at the end of the program, there will be time for those to be answered. The Q&A function is at the bottom of your menu that goes along the bottom of your screen. And so please type your questions in there. We are recording tonight's program, so you will find it on the YouTube channel, the library's YouTube channel, in about a week. And you can invite your friends and family who weren't here tonight to see it, but also if you want to go back and refer to some of the information, you'll be able to do that. And so now I'd like to turn things over to Kate Perry of Little Meadow Farm. Thank you, Kate.
Thank you, Elaine. My name is Kate, and I have a small farm in Reading. I graze animals on a budding Reading Land Trust land as part of their decade of stewardship work. You can find more information on that at their website. I'm excited to co-sponsor Whitney Freeman's talk along with the Land Trust. Whitney owns Henny Penny Farm and has grazed Ridgefield conservation land near her farm since 2016. I follow regenerative agriculture standards with a focus on rotational grazing to mitigate invasive plants and improve soil health and pasture growth. Regenerative agriculture is an important and, in my opinion, necessary part of our ecosystem and our food system. It supports healthy watersheds, wildlife habitat, carbon sequestration, a significant topic these days, and more. And regenerative agriculture needs responsibly raised and grazed livestock to fertilize soil without chemicals and to increase biodiversity, among numerous other benefits. All of what I've learned about rotational grazing and a lot of regenerative agriculture has come from Whitney and working at her farm. She's a skilled researcher, planner, and doer, and a dedicated farmer, and I'm grateful to have her as my mentor and friend. The Reading Land Trust and I thank you for attending her talk, and with that, I will hand it over to Whitney.
Thank you, Kate, for a lovely introduction. I'm going to do this screen share. I think I can do this, and there's our talk. I'm going to share, and we will play. Okay, let me, last thing, oops, hold on. My video, so there, then you can see the screen properly. Okay. Well, thank you, Kate and the Reading Land Trust for inviting me tonight and sponsoring this talk. I'm starting off with this slide. This is actually some of the fields that we graze on Ridgefield's conservation land. If you want to make small changes, change the way you do things. If you want to make major changes, change the way you see things. In this talk today, I want to provide you with a manageable body of evidence that might allow you to have a shift in mindset about livestock farming and both its role with our environment and feeding our bodies. As Albert Einstein said, problems cannot be solved with the same mindset that created them. I will encounter people who spout off information which has become their facts, like, you know, eating meat causes cancer, or cow farts are killing the planet, or farming is responsible for climate change. And given the nature of how we consume media, we latch on to easily understandable blurbs that we see dotted around the internet or on processed food packaging. But the role of agriculture in the context of our climate and our bodies is not something we can just boil down to 10 quick facts and you go on your way. We are going to dispel some myths tonight, however. And yes, at the end of this talk, I will give you action points to make better informed choices. However, to be able to speak to these points, it does require us to settle into a broader discussion and conversation. This topic can feel overwhelming at points because you'll see how it is more of a web of interconnected processes that we interact with rather than a linear flow. But I want you to look at this as an opportunity to focus on different areas to inform yourself on bite, bite, bite. So don't get overwhelmed. So what are we looking at here? This is one of the fields that we graze on the Richfield Conservation Land. The top photo was after my first month. McKeon is the name of the open space there in Richfield. So prior to my arrival, it had a long history. It was a private dairy farm. And then when the farm went for sale, the town of Ridgefield bought the land to conserve it, and it had been grazed. It continued to be grazed by cattle for almost a couple decades before I had arrived, not quite. And it had been conventionally farmed. So what that meant was, for example, this was a 4-acre field. And over the course of 1 month, there were 5 cows in this 4 acres. And then my 6 ewes and 8 lambs and my 2 very young llamas. So you can see in that picture on the top, my daughter is standing next to the 2 llamas, and she's young, so that you can see how tiny they are. That picture, you're seeing a field that has been completely overgrazed, heavily trampled in the soil, compacted. So what happens when you stick cows or any animals in a field, if you give them a big field, they're going to look for their favorite food first. And then they'll walk around and look for their second favorite food next. And then they'll find the third favorite while they wait for the first one to regrow. And they'll keep going in this cycle. So they walk around a lot, hunting and searching for food. Then there's the food that they do not want to eat. It's like their broccoli. So that's what they just let go to seed. So you see in this picture, it's all brown because at this point, after a month, everything they liked has been chewed right to the ground, and everything they didn't like has gone to seed. So then the lower picture, we're looking at the same field. This is last July. So this was my 6th season grazing. So after that first year of the top photo, I then took on the grazing contract of those fields. And so I just grazed with my sheep herd and a couple guard llamas. So the bottom picture shows that very same field after several years of rotational grazing, which we'll talk about what that means later. But last year, what we did was those same 4 acres, we divided into 13 paddocks, and we moved daily, sometimes twice per day. We kept the sheep in tiny paddocks, if you can imagine, 4 acres divided by 13, with a lot of sheep, so that we put down 120 pounds of a custom seed mix. And with the intent, the seed mix was designed for soil improvement and soil health. And then all of those little sheep hooves pushed the seed into the ground, and then they moved on to their next paddock. And we grazed the whole 4 acres in about 2 weeks, and we left those fields. So this bottom photo is a couple weeks after grazing, and there's a whole bunch of new seedlings starting to emerge. So the next slide, we're going to look at, this is a cross section of healthy soil versus compacted soil. So, and I decided to leave it as my hand-drawn sketch because if we were in a lecture hall, this is what I would have drawn on the whiteboard. The healthy soil on the left, in the cross section, you see plants at the above the surface. The plants are never grazed below 3 inches. And honestly, they're probably never grazed below 5 inches because you really want to leave the plant with enough mass that it can continue photosynthesis. Those plants therefore have deeper roots. Those plants exude nutrients, they're called exudates, which feed the biological diversity in the soil. And the microorganisms, those exudates, all together create this sticky substance, and you have aggregates of soil. And the aggregates, you also have air spaces then. And we'll talk about this continually, but those spaces allow for water to infiltrate better when we have rain events. The soil is alive. I like to think of it as a superorganism. I like to think of it like a bee colony. The entire soil ecosystem is a collaborative environment. The plants and the microorganisms actually work together. The microorganisms can detect when plants are in distress, and they actually can supply more nutrients to the plants. Likewise, the plants supply nutrients to the microorganisms on a regular basis. The picture on the right is a cross-section of heavily overgrazed soil. The roots are short. The plant is obviously very short at the top. There's less nutrients, less biology. There are no aggregates in the soil. There's no air spaces. So when you get a rain event, all that water runs off the surface, all your nutrients run off the surface, nothing's going back into the ground. And ultimately there's less carbon stored. So this first mindset shift, I want to ask you to think of the soil from now on as a superorganism. So everything on this planet is connected to soil. It is linked to every other cycle on the planet. It is the link that I think we've ignored for quite a while. Yeah, we know we shouldn't pollute the soil, but we haven't really been feeding it and nurturing it for that long. It's like having a stray dog. It's not poisoned by the food it scrounges, but it certainly is not supported by healthy food, warm shelter year round. There's a difference between surviving and thriving. So this slide I've taken from the Soil Health Academy. It's one of the references I have at the end of this talk for you to refer to. The 6 principles of soil health. First, you need to grow healthy animals and soil together. You cannot have healthy soil without livestock, particularly ruminants. Ruminants have shaped the grasslands on our planets forever, as long as we've had grasslands. They are linked to each other. Second, you don't want to disturb the soil. In nature, there's no mechanical or chemical disturbances of soil. Third, you want to cover and build armor on the surface. So it means that, again, you are trying to protect that delicate biology within the soil. Fourth, mix it up. So nature thrives on diversity, as honestly we do as people as well. Monoculture is not going to allow nature to thrive. 5, keep living roots in the soil. So that means for as much of the year as you can have living roots in the soil, the healthier your soil will be. And this is talking more about crops, because obviously in pasture, we always keep living roots in the soil. And 6, know your context. So all of this is the theory, but in different parts of the world, different cultures, there are different historical practices with our soils. We need to look at how farmers have been farming the land in certain regions, and to transition to a different type of farming requires sensitivity to the people who are the farmers as well as the environment. So this slide, I love this diagram of the soil. It's just so fun. So soil is as important to take care of and nurture as our pollinators, our mammals, our birds, and more. Because without the soil, none of these other creatures will eventually exist. Part of soil is the detritus sphere. So in this picture on the left side, you see the little zooming in of that top surface of the soil. That zone on the soil surface is where living things that have died and feces begin to be broken down by microorganisms that are in the soil. So these living things that are being broken down are both plants and animals that have died. So if I were talking to my camp kids here, I would say soil is an omnivore, right? Soil is sustained by dead animals, dead plants. So soil is not sterile. It's teeming with life, but it's sustained by death. So omnivores and carnivores sustain themselves by consuming meat. We are omnivores. Back in 2008, a friend gave me The Omnivore's Dilemma by Michael Pollan. It completely changed how I looked at the food I ate. I felt I couldn't eat chicken anymore unless I knew how it was raised. Honestly, it's probably what gave me the impetus to migrate from horticulture to livestock. Therefore, first of all, animals do need to be raised for meat. Meat provides a nutrient-dense food source for people. And nutrient-dense means that you can eat 3 ounces of meat. That's a really tiny portion of meat, and get anywhere from half to all of your vitamin B12 recommended for an adult for the day. And vitamin B12 is not found in vegetables, but rather in meat and dairy. And lamb also provides a source of iron in the heme form, which is more readily absorbed by our bodies than in its non-heme form. And yes, while in affluent parts of the world, we can just take dietary supplements and meet our dietary needs, but that's not really an option in much of the world. So if I ate, so this is from the American Lamb Association, their website. I also have at the end for reference. If I eat a 3-ounce piece of lamb, I'd get 23 grams of protein. if I eat an entire tin of garbanzo beans or black-eyed peas, because I had to look in my cupboard today, I would only get 21 grams of protein. Well, that's a lot of beans for one person to eat. So in a tiny bite-sized amount, you get a lot of nutrition. I think the shift as a culture needs to be that we don't need to overeat meat. We need to eat meat that's been raised correctly or mindfully for the environment. We don't need large quantities of meat. So we just touched a little bit on how we do need animals part of sustaining the soil and sustaining our bodies. Let's look at the impact of agriculture on our planet as a whole now. So 38%, just over a third of all available land on Earth is used for agriculture. And 2/3 of that third, or over a third, is marginal land. 2/3 means that it's land that cannot be used for anything else except grazing. They're not lands that could be ever have crops on them. They're like the rocky areas that four-legged ruminants can access, but not humans trying to grow crops. So in other parts of the world, people are using grazing to restore pasture lands that have become desertified. So that means areas of pasture that used to be fertile have become deserts, and they're using livestock to reinvigorate these lands. Alan Savory was a pioneer, or is a pioneer, in this area. So you can look into his work in South Africa. This is in Mexico, in Argentina. And this is a point where we're looking for mindset shift 3. So to stop looking at livestock as killing the planet and start to see that many of the messages we do hear are those driven by marketing rather than those reflecting science, right? What fills our social media, a lot of it's driven by marketing. So regenerative agriculture, this is a word that you're starting to hear more. It's a conservation and rehabilitation approach that focuses on soil health, which increases the carbon carrying capacity of soil, and it keeps carbon moving in that cycle. So we will use livestock to mimic those great herds of bison and elk that used to graze our plains of North America. And what regenerative agriculture does is it improves soil structure. It's going to improve water infiltration through increased soil agglomeration and aggregates. It uses biomimicry. It uses eco-mimicry. So it's mimicking nature through using livestock. Through using livestock to simulate what used to happen, right? So those great herds of bison that would come through an area and then not return again for a while. Regenerative agriculture increases diversity and density of plants above the soil. It increases quantities and varieties of insects, pollinators, birds, and therefore, as a result, these larger species as well. And it improves both the number and the diversity within bird populations. And it's important to remember that everything we do, there is no neutral impact. It's either positive or negative. And with grazing, you do need a minimum number to really start doing this. So it's a little challenging to try to do regenerative agriculture with 2 sheep, for example. You do need to have enough to be able to use their mass to start changing the dynamic of the soil. So here we're going to delve in lightly into 4 cycles that the soil is intricately linked with. So we're going to start with photosynthesis, right? We all learned about that in school, right? It's where the sun's energy is made into usable energy by the plants. And in that little diagram there, you can see how the plant exudates are feeding bacteria, fungi, protozoa, and they work together and you end up with this huge diversity in the soil. Why do the aggregates matter? As we touched upon earlier, you're going to get a soil that's therefore porous. Water and air are going to flow through it. The soil does need to breathe. You're going to get plants and microbial growth that way, and the roots will penetrate. So that picture on the left is actually that annual seed mix I talked about in the very first slide. This is a close-up of it. These plants, there were some radishes that would leave behind great, huge, I want to say holes, but they were like 6 inches, 8 inches deep, 2 inches wide. So the idea was that as they grew, towards the end of the season, the sheep would rip them out. They would eat them. They would digest it, poop it out. That nutrition goes back into the ground, all composted, ready to support the biological diversity. The space that's left behind also helps open up that soil. And in a soil that's been heavily compacted, that's hugely valuable. Photosynthesis also makes nutrients available and supplies the nutrients to those microorganisms in the soil. You also have, therefore, the organic matter from the plants as those leaves die down at the end of the season and they'll decompose. And then you're feeding that detritosphere, that layer there. And finally, erosion. Without plants on the surface, you get erosion. In 1997, it was estimated there were 2 billion tons per year being lost in the US due to erosion. So it's really important that we take care of our soils. So coming back to this slide, we're going to look at the rain cycle, that top right. Again, a pretty simple cycle, right? They're bodies of water, they evaporate. Your plants evapotranspire. You get condensation up in clouds and then it precipitates down. Well, recent studies have shown too how those microorganisms that are in the soil do go up in the droplets of water in the form of, those are bioaerosols. And so there are many cycles and many natural processes that their presence is involved in. It is one of the ways that life, microorganisms move between different areas, right? Because they evaporate in one place and they move with the clouds and they're going to rain down somewhere else. And then on the bottom right there, we look at the nutrient cycle. This is the one, this is kind of the hot button issue that you'll hear about, carbon sequestration. So we'll have a look at this. So that fun fact that cow farts are killing the planet. It's a ridiculous idea, but it's a really fun, quotable non-fact. So cows are part of the carbon cycle. We have, if you look at that, if you said that we had a closed system, we have that the cow eats the plants. The cow poops out, the plants have the carbon. The cow poops out more carbon, it goes into the soil. The cow also burps methane. Methane goes up into the atmosphere. It's converted to carbon dioxide and water. That then eventually comes down from the atmosphere and eventually is used by the plants. And then the carbon will make its way down into the soil and it's going to be in the roots of the plants and it will be locked up by all those microbes in the soil. And this soil continues to be built through this cycle, right? Because the cows eat the grass, they create more manure, and as the soil is healthier, you get a deeper root system and you get a larger layer of organic matter on the top of the soil. So in some of the ancient, the older prairies, they used to have roots that were taller than a man. They were extremely deep, but through erosion and changes in farming practices, those don't really exist much now. The picture on the left is showing the difference between fossil fuels and the regular carbon cycle with the cows. Fossil fuels are unlocking carbon that there's carbon that's been locked in our planet. And when we bring up the ancient carbon and process it and emit fossil fuels, we're releasing more carbon. So we're adding carbon to the atmosphere. The cows are just cycling whatever carbon already existed through this cycle with the grass and the rain. So at their peak, it was estimated that there were 60 million bison in the 1700s. And it was estimated that there were 10 million elk. There are today 93 million head of cattle in this country, according to the USDA. So we're talking numbers of ruminants in the same range, right? We're talking like 70 million versus 93 million. We're in the same range. So it's not that just we have more cows now than before, it's how we manage them has changed, right? So big feedlots, that's a complete change in management. The cow is no longer part of this carbon cycle. And yes, that is when the manure management becomes a problem. So last thing, coming back to this slide, the cycle that the soil is connected to is the community of living. So what that's saying is that none of these cycles can happen without microorganisms, ruminants, you and me and all living creatures. And if you remove one thing, you change the cycle. Okay, so how do we support this? Let's settle into a little bit of science to look how exactly livestock can save the planet. If we look at food, growing food as a way to restore soils. Think of your garden or farm not like a fish tank, but like your connection to the stars. So when I was a kid, I had a fish tank. And if the pH was too low, I added one chemical. If the pH was too high, I added another chemical. And that fish tank wasn't connected to anything else in the environment. It was its own little ecosystem. That was it. But our gardens or farms are not like that. They're not isolated. Everything you do, everything we do down here is connected to the clouds in the sky and our atmosphere. So regenerative agriculture talks about adaptive stewardship. And so this is what we started moving to last year. Adaptive stewardship is based upon these three rules. The idea that there are compounding effects of everything that we do. Like I said earlier, there's nothing negative. It's either positive. Well, sorry, there's nothing neutral. It's either positive or negative. So as a farmer, you have to decide what your goal is for that grazing season and how are you going to achieve it. And it's all an experiment. There's no textbook because every farm is different, meaning every bit of land is different. Every composition of what livestock you're using is different. Cows versus sheep will be different. But that's the beauty of it. That is what the dynamic nature of it. The second rule is disruption. This is kind of my favorite rule. This is the idea that nature becomes stagnant if we just settle into a routine. So you need to mix it up all the time. You need to make life difficult. So if we relate as people, if you want to get fit, you need to make life difficult for your muscles. You need to exercise. If you want to be mentally stronger or maybe mentally balanced, you need to go through trauma in your life, right? Life is not easy. Those difficult things that come into our life, which will come into everybody's life, when you get through that, you are stronger, you are adapted, you're more resilient. Nature is the same. So we create disruptions. And when we say that, that might be like at points of the year, we may graze the land with not many animals, so not a lot of pressure. And then at other points, we may mob them up. So there's a very dense pack of sheep coming through. And then we let it recover again. And finally, diversity. So like we said, nature does not thrive on monoculture, nor do we. And so in diversity, we need every type of organism to thrive. In the industrial agricultural model, it's focused on killing things. But that mindset, as Gabe Brown said, was killing diversity, was killing the soil, and killing farmers' profit, right? You can't keep going on with the idea that, you know, once synthetic fertilizers came along and all of the pesticides came along, it just seemed like the easy solution to just kill the bad things, that there's a chemical for every problem, which personally, I think that's the same idea with supplements too. You know, I don't think that supplements, just taking the supplement is the same as having the original food that could supply those nutrients. So this diagram is what we were talking about on the very first slide. Continuous grazing is what had been happening in those fields prior to my arrival. So what that was one big field would have the cows for, let's say, a month. So this is saying you're grazing basically all the time. The land never gets a break. What that means is you cannot sustain many animals that way. You're not going to be able to provide food for enough people that way. You can't continue farming like that. And you can see in that picture, there's more surface water There's more water runoff. There's no biological activity in the soil. The roots are short. The next is rotational grazing, and that's what we moved to for about 4 or 5 years. That's the idea that you graze for a quarter of the time and the land recovers 3/4 of the time. That's definitely a vast improvement, and you can see in this picture. So what I was talking about, that organic layer, meaning that carbon-filled layer, the layer filled with humus and decaying animal, vegetable matter, that dark layer gets thicker. Your roots get deeper. You start to see more biological activity in the soil. You also now can have a little more density of livestock. You can see in the picture, we got 2 cows. Well, the next step on is adaptive grazing. And so that's what we moved to last year, and we continue to do that this year. Adaptive grazing, the reason why it took a while too is it's more labor intensive, but also you need to observe your land. You need to become a good observer in order to practice any of this farming. Like I said, there's no textbook. You can't just go read what you should do, step 1, step 2, step 3. It doesn't work like that. You need to be able to learn how to read your pastures and know what they're going to do over the course of the season, because what they look like in spring, you may be surprised come summer that there's no food, or in the fall they look good, especially in our climate because we have such a changing temperature and water, right? So we are getting heavier rainfalls. That changes some years. We have dry years, and you need time to observe it. So we started adaptive grazing last year, and that meant that we graze a particular spot 5% of the time, and then it rests 95% of that time. That also meant that we were moving a lot more often, which in our particular setup is more labor intensive. If you owned your land, you might put and we also are surrounded by busy roads. So if we lived in a quieter area where if the odd rogue sheep hopped out and it's not a big deal, that might be different. Where we are, we can't afford that to happen. So it's a little more labor intensive with the type of electric netting we use. But basically, the animals mob up in this method. So adaptive grazing is working off the ideas of those bison herds. So the animals mob up to stay safe from predators. That's just what animals do. We have llama to protect our sheep, but in the wild kingdom, that's what happens. And what's our tool to move, mob, and mow? It's the electric fence. So that's how we get the sheep to mimic what the bisons would be doing. So how does this all save the planet? Well, the more biological diversity in the soil, the increased carbon holding capacity it has, part of the carbon cycle. The huge amounts of carbon in the atmosphere are primarily from industry and cities. They're not directly from farming. It could be transportation, yes, manufacturing. Changes on how large-scale farming happens allows the land to absorb some of man's mistakes. And we still need to tackle large-scale commercial manufacturing, etc. And how does it directly affect non-farmers? Well, food production has been moved away from cities and towns. So a lot of us are disconnected from how food is produced. As we put more emphasis to grow more food and faster, we're seeing a decline in the nutritional health of our food. And experts believe that actually the soil microbes could also have a big impact on the nutritional content of our food. So moreover, the plants that we eat and the dirt that we come into contact with may actually directly fortify our own gut microbiomes. So the idea, the best scenario is to eat a huge diversity of plants. There's even studies showing that the microbes that can be found in the soil and therefore would be on some plants have been shown to have effects on mental health. So they did a study with senior patients that were about to go, well, that went into surgery. And sometimes there are issues after anesthesia for older patients with cognitive or mental function afterwards, and that when they gave a certain group of patients certain microbes that are present in the soil, they showed far greater recovery after surgery. Soil bacteria and fungi also work in tandem to make minerals in the ground water soluble. So if they're soluble, the plant can suck them up with its roots. So there was a study published in the Journal of American College of Nutrition, which examined 43 crops, and they were comparing present nutrient levels to those recorded in 1950 by the USDA. And the USDA has been collecting this data since 1892. And they found that protein, calcium, iron, phosphorus, and vitamin B2, that's riboflavin, and vitamin C had all dropped markedly. So yes, there are arguments that we've been selecting for plant productivity and disease resistance rather than nutritional value, but we also cannot ignore the advent of huge monoculture farms and the decline of mixed farming. So before, farmers would harvest their corn crops, and then afterwards, let their cows graze the stalks and provide manure to that soil. So the change in our farming practices is also detrimental to our food, the value, the nutrient value of our food. So one of the things as a consumer is to think about the questions to ask about your food. So is it produced in huge swathes of monoculture? A lot of what we're going to find at most of our supermarkets, that answer would be yes. So what can we do about that? Well, first of all, search for regenerative farms, particularly for your animal proteins. I did a quick search for Connecticut here, and I found several farms in the state that talk about regenerative farming practices that they do on their farm. And honestly, if you look and read on a page and you hear or read things that are similar to what I'm describing, like some farms, like I honestly don't even know if I put the word regenerative farming on our website recently. I described the process, but that word has only become part of our regular language in the last couple of years. And I've been so busy farming that I haven't been redoing the website. And even if a farm were not dedicated to regenerative practices, a pasture-raised chicken is still a far smaller environmental impact than a factory-raised chicken. So if you're able to get to a farmer's market, that is an ideal starting point. And if you Google online, there are an abundance of farmers markets. Where we are here in Connecticut, there's an abundance. If you're near New York City, there also is an abundance of farmers markets. You just have to do a little searching and find out what days there are. And I can tell you that, so we sell at the New Canaan Farmers Market, and we buy all of our vegetables exclusively at the farmers market. And we eat so well because we're eating food that's in season. And in Connecticut, for sure, actually in New England, honestly, there, as a whole, there aren't huge monoculture farms. It's just the terrain. It's the nature of our land, right? We don't have, most people don't have like 10,000 acres here. So a lot of farms are mixed farms, and you can ask a farmer about their practices and particularly what you're concerned about and have a conversation. Most farmers are happy to talk about it, but it's more than just the quick question. You know, sometimes I get to ask the question of, well, are your animals fed soy? Is it organic? But that's just the tip of the iceberg, because it's more about the bigger picture, right? So it doesn't matter. Yes, I mean, it's a presumption on my part. We don't spray anything to kill anything. But likewise, if you feed them organic food, there's so much more that you can do beyond just that to help support the soil health. So if you do a quick search online, you will see, though, there are a lot of regenerative farms in Connecticut. And if you're not in Connecticut and there aren't regenerative farms near you, there are actually more and more that are shipping Now, yes, your environmental impact of shipping is there, but you can make certain decisions on that. Another thing is if you took a 30-day commitment to not eating processed foods, because processed foods are hugely environmentally unfriendly. Between the packaging, the processing, it's not, if you just eat food, how it's been grown in the ground, or the animals, how they've been, raised on the pasture and then processed, it is far more favorable to the environment than eating processed foods. And when you start, if you made a 30-day commitment, you would start to see how much food as a culture we eat that's processed, from cereal and crackers to all our sauces and endless things that are processed. And the last thing is to keep learning, a commitment to learning. This is not a topic that you can just get 4 answers and be done. You never need to look at this again, because one, it's a subject area that is continually getting new data. So in recent years, the heavy hitters like General Mills and some of those big food companies have started to see the value in regenerative farming. And it's no surprise, it is, of course, there's monetary interest. Yes, it's financially beneficial to them, but it's also beneficial to the environment. And so they've been funding studies, and universities have been funding studies looking at to see if data is starting to look like that the food that's produced through regenerative farming is more nutrient dense. And a body of evidence is being accumulated. But again, that's not something you can accumulate overnight. So this is a page of references, websites that have vast amounts of information. And some of it's very much geared towards consumers. You don't have to be a farmer to look at all this. The Soil Health Academy, it's a nonprofit run by some of the leaders and pioneers in this industry. They're people who worked for the USDA. There are farmers, there are university researchers that run it. Soil Carbon Cowboys is a video online, and it looks at different farms doing these practices. Sacred Cow, it's a book or a video. You'll find that as well online. And if you have a little space for livestock, you'd be interested to read Dirt to Soil by Gabe Brown. And he's also one of the founders of the Soil Health Academy. Another thing is learn how to cook different cuts of meat, right? So if you want to get meat from a regenerative farm, let's say you buy like a half lamb or a half cow, and you use every part of the animal, there's far less waste, right? Like half the part of our food system is that there's so much waste. We don't know how to cook anymore because we eat all our processed foods. And for lamb, because that's what we raise, the AmericanLamb.com, the American Lamb Board has a fantastic website. You can look up and say, well, I want to grill something, and it'll tell you which cut you should get, and it has recipes. So it's extremely user-friendly. It's a great resource. Bionutrient Food Association, another association that has an abundance of information. You can join them as well as a member and meet other like-minded individuals and share information. Hawthorne Valley Farms is a really fun day trip from the area. I stopped there on the way back from Hudson, New York on a trip, and it's paired with a Waldorf school, but it is a biodynamic farm. It has a store, it has a summer camp, it has programs. And then the American Farmland Trust, they actually, for Earth Day, they sent out an email last week, I think, and it's on their website, featuring farmers who are regeneratively farming, farmers that are thinking with a mind towards environmental improvement, I guess, right? Fixing the mistakes that we've done to the environment. And you're welcome to visit our farm. We do programming, we have membership. We have regular store hours where you can just visit the home farm. The home farm is tiny though, it's just 2 acres. And we do environmental stewardship using animals on our tiny bit of land. Particularly it's in the wetlands. But the larger scale with the fields is down the road from where the home farm is. But if you visit the home farm, then we can tell you where the footpath is to go enjoy the pastures. So I'd like to thank my two talk sponsors, Little Meadow Farm and the Reading Land Trust. Thank you for having me, as well as the Mark Twain Library. That's everything I'd like to share. Thank you for having me. I'm going to do stop my screen share.
Thank you, Whitney. That was wonderful. Great information. And now we're going to open up for questions. And we do have questions already coming in from the audience. And so if you haven't put your question in yet, please go ahead and type that in now. Whitney, our first question is composting the correct term for the animal waste sitting on the top of the soil? A compost pile reaches a temperature of about 160 degrees to kill the harmful bacteria from the material added. Animal waste on the soil top doesn't reach this temperature.
Correct. Yes, it's not composting. It is decomposing. So that's where it says like the detritus in the detritosphere is decomposing. So it's a different process. So it's the opposite. We're feeding the microbes that manure. I guess I use the word composting that as in ruminants with their 4 stomachs, the manure that they poop out is somewhat composted plants already. So in their stomach, they chew the plants, then they throw it up, chew their cud, swallow it again. And then when they poop it out, those plants are already kind of composted. And I'm using this more in a generic, not scientific term. But so with that being said, you can throw sheep manure on your veggie garden and it doesn't burn your plants. It's ready to go.
Good, thank you. And how many sheep do you have on your 4 acres? And then they ask about density wise, I think.
Right, so actually the fields I have is 18 acres. So that 4-acre field is just one of all of the 18 acres. So we have, of the 18 acres, we keep up to 85 sheep. And that is based on because we have a lease contract with the town. I think we could actually keep more sheep, but it would depend on the condition of the soil. So currently 85 sheep are perfectly well sustained. You could not keep 85 sheep through conventional grazing methods on 18 acres. So you would have to adaptively graze like we do, or not environmentally friendly as much, but it would be like, well, you could feed hay, you could supplement with hay, and that's fine. But you couldn't just throw 85 sheep on 18 acres and say, see ya at winter.
Okay, very good, thank you. And then I have a long one to read for you. Hi, Whitney. It's fellow Ridgefielder Mike McManus watching and listening with 2 of my daughters who you've met when we came by. We are the ones with the chickens at home. Anyway, great talk. I had the girls watch the Sacred Cow documentary as well, and we all loved it. My question is, how do we help to move past this plant-based agenda in marketing that is spewing false information and continuing to scare people away from meat and a willingness to think about concepts like regenerative agriculture?
Yeah.
It goes on to say, we are huge fans of what you're doing, but
thank you. I think honestly, the spreading of misinformation is a huge problem. I know it's a problem for our business. I know things that I know personally, and this is related to food. I used to like Lucky Brand jeans. And when they had their campaign, was it 2 years ago, saying that they were selling synthetic sweaters to protect the sheep from being abused by shearing, I couldn't buy their stuff anymore because that's complete misinformation. Sheep have been bred to be shorn. Ancient, the heritage sheep varieties used to shed their wool, but we have selectively bred for sheep that need to be sheared. And again, that misinformation being spread is a huge disservice to an entire industry. It's saying, use plastic and put plastic in our oceans as opposed to use a sustainable material like wool. And I think honestly, the best way to combat the misinformation is to try to be an advocate to spread that information, I don't want to say the right information because that's the wrong way to say it, but to spread those things that you know to be true through science, right? And I think Personally, it's through educating kids. And I think a lot of it too is because we've become so disconnected from where our food comes from. So in our farm camp, we know I have a lot of kids come through here, and we don't hide that the animals are part of our food system. We talk about that those chickens are our meat chickens. And it's interesting because a lot of people ask me about the word cull, and they're like, well, what's the difference between that and slaughter? I'm like, well, slaughter makes you think of like a brutal death, right? Cull is a mindful, intentional end to an animal's life in a mindful way and respecting their life, right? We all are going to die. And it's the highest hope is that, right? That we can help each other, leave a positive impact, and have a joyful life when we're here, right? We all kind of hope for that. So that's the best that we can hope for our animals. But I think it's spreading this message to the younger generation, because I know in my generation, I think so many adults kind of were like, I want better for my kids. You don't need to be a farmer. You don't need to know where your food comes from. We can get it in a supermarket. So let's stop talking about where our meat comes from, and let's just get it in the store and bring it home. So I think educating our kids and normalizing that this animal is where your meat comes from, and it's not a bad thing. It doesn't make you a bad person, but educating and not hiding from the fact, I don't get as many people. I mean, occasionally still people go, oh, I couldn't do what you do. And it's not that we take pleasure at all in any animals passing, but it's a job of service, right? Every farmer is a servant. You're serving your community and you're serving the planet. And I think spreading as much positive information as an advocate is the greatest service you can do.
And you're practicing what you're preaching, right? Because tomorrow I know you're taking this talk into your daughter's school. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah. So tomorrow I'm talking to, I think she told me there's 80 of them, 80 6th to 8th graders. And honestly, I think kids, of that age, they're used to thinking outside of the box. They're used to questioning. I get great questions from kids that are like 7, 8 years old, because they're just taking in all this information and they don't judge, they just absorb. So yeah, it's best thing is to educate the kids, and they educate their parents in return.
That's right. Very good. Another question is, farmers markets are not always not available year round. So does that affect your diet?
Yes, it does. It does. And I will confess that as much as I would like, there are some winter farmers markets in the area. I do find it hard, right? We're lambing in the winter. I can't get to a winter's farmers market. It does change how I eat drastically. I do try to preserve some vegetables that I can from the markets, but no, it changes. As soon as like next week comes, we eat a lot better for about 8 months. And that too, like you're right, you always aspire to be better. I hope that maybe next year I too will make a better plan for my winter food supply. None of us are perfect, but yeah, it does affect my food as well. Most of our food we can get from the farmer's market. We can get all our vegetables, all our meat, even pasta. The only things we really can't get are like flour and rice, like some grains, but everything else we can eat at the farmer's market.
It's good to know.
Yeah.
What was the book? You had mentioned a book. Somebody wants to know, Omnivore's
Dilemma.
And who was that by?
That's by Michael Pollan. Yeah, that was a pioneering book. And he's gone on to write a lot of books since then. But when I read that book, that was my eye-opening moment. I think that was before there's so many videos out there now, but that was the one that made me go, oh my goodness. Like, I never realized any of this. And I understand where sometimes people have this knee-jerk reaction of, oh, the animals are abused, I can't eat meat anymore. It's the same reaction, right? You read something, it gives you just this bit of information that makes you realize that everything I thought is not what it is. But now, with so much more information available too, I'd say too, you need to keep reading. Don't just read one thing and think that's your Bible. Keep reading.
Very good. Thank you. Can we consider chickens as a beneficial element to regenerative farming and free range?
Yeah.
Is that?
Yes, although they can't be integral, you do need ruminants because of the way they break down the carbon. Like I was talking about, they kind of compost it with those multiple stomachs.
Mhm.
Chickens though, so mixed livestock, that aspect of not monoculture is a huge part. So I'm on leased townland, so I don't have the flexibility. I can't just throw on chickens or pigs or cows. I have a lease. If I didn't, I would definitely, like, the idea of you have cows and you get followed by chickens afterwards. The chickens go and pick all the fly larvae out of those giant cow pies, and they help disperse the cow pies. And it's the same idea. If you have cows and then you follow the cow herd with your sheep, the sheep eat things that the cows don't eat, and vice versa. So you can have a beautiful symbiotic system. So after I read The Omnivore's Dilemma, one of the people who's mentioned in that book was Joel Salatin of Polyface Farm. And he is a great orator. He's very entertaining, charismatic. He has videos online, he has books. So I watched, there was a documentary on Polyface Farm. I don't remember what it was called anymore, but if you look it up, it's online. And it was screened by, I don't know if it was NOFA, I think it might have been, at one of the nature centers. This is a while ago, like 5-6 years ago. And at that time, so Penny's 6, she was like 7 years old. I brought her with me because it was in the evening. I wanted to watch this. I was like, you're just going to come with me. And we're sitting there and this whole video, you know, this movie. And she passes me a note and she's like, is this a real place? And I'm like, yeah, it's a real place. We're watching a documentary about this farm and all of this pioneering work he did. And then she's like, can we go there? So I was like, okay. So we did a road trip to Nashville, and we drove to Virginia to Polyface, and you can go there. And it's a big version. So we modeled our farm after kind of what they had done. So we're like a mini version. But it was great to see it in person. You can go there if you're ever in Virginia. They do group tours. The he's the lunatic farmer is what he calls himself. I think we did a private tour because they wouldn't allow a 7-year-old on the group tour. You had to do a private tour. But again, that's the thing of, right, teaching your kids, leading by example and letting them be exposed. They understand like a lot more than you think.
And what was the name of the farm again?
Polyface.
Polyface. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Mm-hmm.
And we have a question again about the diversity per acre. Sylvia has kind of corrected, but maybe what I misstated. What she means is how we know the right density per acres. I have a small fiber farm, and we are moving to regenerative farm with our flock.
Right. So that question is, it comes with time and experience. And it comes with, so what happens is you need to know your land first. You also have to know how much grass a sheep will eat. And there are tons of calculations, but they really cannot, they're not going to work. You need to know what you have there and look and observe. So my answer would be like, don't get 20 sheep on your 2 acres and then go, uh-oh, there's not enough food. So whenever people come to our farm in the winter, and like right now we're at the end of lambing season, all our sheep come home. Our farm's 2 acres. The sheep in the winter are probably on 3/4 acre. And I tell everybody, you cannot do this long-term. This is not sustainable. This would be very environmentally unfriendly. But they come home, they have their babies. That way they're safe from predators. And they go back to the fields. So you need to start. I mean, the ideal is you start with a few and you move them and you observe. What you're looking for is how quickly does that grass regenerate. Another thing would be add annuals. Throw down annual seed, and you can try different things. So what we put down was Crazy Ray's summer mix. It's a Ray Archuleta who used to work for the USDA. That's his, if you look that up, it has all what's in it and what percentages. I get a seed company to mix it up for me because I couldn't get it locally. And something like that will feed the soil and allow you to have a denser amount of sheep on that land. And it depends on, are we talking full sun, or if there's some shade, if there's some trees, if we're talking more forest. But it is an experiment, which can be kind of exciting, but I'd say don't start with too many and run out of food, because then that gets really expensive.
Thank you. And what do you feel the future of regenerative farming will be? Will this movement continue to grow?
I think so. I do. I think the fact that you're seeing large food companies showing great interest in it, that alone is going to push things along. I mean, 20, 30 years ago, right? Organic was just a word that people heard a little bit but didn't know about. And this is the idea of you can take organic, but look at it in the context of a bigger system. Look at it in the context of the whole ecosystem, not just, and organic does cover a lot of that. So I don't want to take away from that, but I think it's a very important piece. But having animals part of it, it needs to happen. You can't take animals out. You can't have animals over here and your food, like your crops, over here. And that's what integrated farms used to be. And I think there's a huge rising interest in farming. More younger people are returning to it. I think there was a whole generation that kind of stopped that it was the idea of like, no, I want better for my kids. I want them to go to college. I don't want them to be a farmer or whatever. So I do think it's an area that is going to grow.